in the world?
So, when I was 15, my parents took me to Europe for the summer, and they told me I could bring a friend. I thought I was the closest friend. And we went from Paris down to south to Nice. We were tennis players. Well, I've been tennis forever. Went into Italy, then drove north to Munich, where there were still Scheinmann shoe stores. My grandfather in the shoe business. And then on the way back to France, we stopped, first of all, in Strasbourg, which is in eastern France. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves on this winding mountain road. And at the top of this road is this most sinister place I've ever seen. I'm sure you've seen pictures of concentration camps. This one was out of the way, isolated, on purpose, because it was meant to be away from prying eyes. And this was my first real exposure to my father's trajectory during the war. But in fact, I went back to high school where Paul and I were, and I wrote an essay and won a prize, not because I was a great writer, but because the subject matter was so powerful. So that was my first real exposure to what my father had done during the war.
Why don't you tell people where the name of the camp and where the camp was located?
So when the Germans invaded France, the region of Alsace had gone back and forth between France and Germany. It had been French. There was the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The Germans won that war. It became Germany. World War I occurred. It went back to France. World War II, the Germans steamrolled right through it, and they reclaimed those regions which bordered Germany and made them actually part of Germany. So from the German perspective, they were no longer French. They were part of Germany.
So this is the Alsace.
This is the Alsace.
And the name of the camp was Natzweiler.
The name of the camp was Natzweiler, which was the village at the bottom of the mountain. It had a double name, Natzweiler Struthof. Struthof is a little farm sort of up the mountain from there, but the official name is Natzweiler.
So it's a very interesting story, how the book came about, came to be written in the first place, and how long it took and how it happened, and it's a remarkable set of circumstances that led to the fact that there was a book published at all. So I'd like to ask you how the book came about and what is your connection to the writer, the one who has my namesake, but it's not related to me,
Right.
Diana Mara Henry.
I have to really acknowledge Diana. She's done yeoman's work for many, many years. But 1994 was my 25th college reunion from Harvard. And Harvard puts out this autobiographical book. My wife couldn't be here this evening, called The Best Gossip She's Ever Read, where every alumnus could write whatever they wanted, and it was published. And I was thumbing through the book. It was a couple of weeks before our 25th reunion, and I come across the name Diana Henry, who I hadn't known in college, and I was dumbstruck because right there she talks about having done a photographic study of this little-known camp, Natzweiler. No Americans had ever heard of this camp. Really unusual. And I immediately picked up the phone. She was living in California at the time, of course, no cell phones. And I said, Diana, you know me, we were classmates. Are you coming to the reunion? She said, yes. I said, there's somebody I'd like you to meet. And that was my father, and that was the beginning of a relationship. My father was a charmer, and she was charmed, and he had a story to tell. And he had, for many years already written through fits and spurts in English and French, handwritten, typewritten, two-finger typewritten. We never learned to type with 10 fingers. And that's where we started. And she helped put his memoirs in order. And when he passed away in 2001, she continued editing. And the good news was many archives that had not been opened up began to be opened up. So she plowed through a lot of French, German, English archives that essentially proved out, supported everything that my father had said. And that led finally to the book being published last October by a small English publishing house. That's how it happened.
So it's amazing to me that what the reasons for all this secrecy. The war ends in 1945, and when Michel's father died in 2001, a lot of the official records and everything were still secret to me, with many of them released after he died. So he started fighting in the French Army in 1939, and he was given the name and the identity André Maurice Poulevet. And I think it'd be interesting to explain why was he given a pseudonym, and how did they do that? How did that
So
happen?
my, as Paul had said, my father's family moved to France, northern France. Let's see if I can. To northern France. My grandparents were of Polish origin. Northern France was a big mining area. There were a lot of Polish miners. That was a good place to open a general store. And my grandfather had spoken out against Hitler since an early time, and he was clearly marked to be interned in big concentration camps when Hitler took power. 1938, my father and my grandfather turned in their German passports. They were now stateless, and they volunteered for the French army. My grandfather was refused because of his age, but my father was taken. My father's family, we are Jewish. Not only was he German, he was Jewish, and if he were to have been captured as a German and a Jew, he would not have been accorded what would have been his right as a French soldier, and probably would have been shot on the spot. So the French army, since the time of Napoleon, kept a list of babies that were stillborn. In other words, they were born. There was a birth certificate, but there was no death certificate. So anyone who went looking would find that there was a baby who was born and probably had grown up. But that was the identity my father was given. André Maurice Poulevet, born the same year that he was actually born, 1915, born in the part of the country, northern France, where in fact his family lived, and whose parents had conveniently passed away. So that's how we got his papers, and was officially then, according to those papers, a French citizen. Not a naturalized citizen, but a French-born citizen.
So that's a very important part of the story, because a lot of people would assume that he was in a concentration camp, not even if it wasn't a quote-unquote death camp, that he'd be treated as a Jew. He was never treated as a Jew because they didn't know he was a Jew. He was André Maurice Poulevet, and he knew the Poulevet family history and story, so he had assumed that identity as far as the Germans and his captors were concerned. So that was an important protection for him to have that name. So your dad started fighting for the French army. He was wounded in Belgium in 1940, and he escaped from this POW camp, and you could tell that story, and then you could also go on to tell the story of what he did as part of the French resistance. So you could start off with his escape from the POW camp in 1940.
So even back in Germany, he had, when Hitler took over, my father was actually very secular. I mean, they grew up in a traditional Jewish family, but he was secular, middle class. He considered himself German, of Jewish faith, but German, and had many non-Jewish friends. That stopped in 1933. And he organized Jewish youth to maintain a normal life, and in fact resisted again whatever the Nazis were doing. In France, he volunteered. Training was poor, didn't even know how to fire a gun. It's an interesting story. The Germans invaded. He was wounded. He was sent back to Rennes. You can see on the map, Rennes, which is essentially the district capital of Brittany. You can see the trajectory, interestingly enough. He started in Munich, Düsseldorf, Rouyn-Artois, Rennes. I won't finish the story, but at the end he ends up back in Dachau, full scale. Anyway, he's in Rennes, he's in a hospital. The Germans take over the hospital. He desperately wants to escape because the Germans were sending prisoner of war soldiers to Germany. And the two things he knew is it's much harder to escape once back in Germany, and sooner or later they'd find out who he really was. So he was desperate to escape. The only people who were allowed out of the prisoner of war camp were those who had some kind of injury and had some kind of surgery or operation. His friends there said, "Andre, you must have something. You must." And he said, "Well, I had some internal bleeding." And they said, "That's it. We'll operate you for hemorrhoids." Okay? And he had good friends who were doctors, one of the best surgeons in France. They operated. Good news is the surgery was successful. He got his attestation that he had been operated on, and all he needed was the signature and the stamp. When he presented the attestation to the commandant of the camp, the commandant refused to let him release him. Turns out that he knew a forger. He had to know a lot of people. Right? And he said to the forger, "Can you forge the camp commandant's signature?" He said, "Yes, of course." "What about the stamp?" He said, "Well, find somebody who is just about to be released, who already has the stamp and recent. Find me a potato. Bring me the potato and that attestation, and I can make sure that the stamp will be put on your attestation." Happened. And then the question was, how do you get out of the camps? My father observed what happened, because Germans weren't stupid. There was a number of people who were being released every day. They had to pass through the camp gates. My father noticed that those who were looking at the prisoners were somewhat older. They had been in the German army, been released. They weren't paying attention, and my father slipped out. Now he needs to find out what to do. He goes to a woman he knew in the Red Cross, asks if there's a chance that she would have a room for him. She said yes. I think there was more to it than that, but anyway, as I said, he was a charmer. And now he needed a job. And he was told that the German command in Rennes was looking for an interpreter, and they would pay well. They feed him well, and he said, "I'm not working for the Germans." He never worked for the Germans. A few days later, the French railroads, the SNCF, which is the organization of the French railroads, he found out that they were looking to have an interpreter. and he went and talked to the head of the French railroads, a guy named Louis Toulon, who needed an interpreter for the Germans. He said, okay, I will do that. So he became the interpreter, but working for the French, not for the Germans. For the Germans, they needed the railroads. The railroads were critical. You can see, there's another map here, I'll show you. Well, here is Germany. This is the occupied zone. There were closed zones along the coast where the Germans had their submarine pens, where their destroyers were parked, where there were airfields, and everything had to run on the railroads. Without the railroads, the German war effort would stop. So they needed the French, and they needed to be able to speak to the French. So my father became the interpreter between the French railroads and the German command in charge of all of the activity of the German armies, navies, army of the air, in all of Britain. I can continue from that. Or,
Yeah, I think, so one thing I remember that I will recite, and then I'll ask you another question, but, so, Michel's father, when you read this book, he thought of absolutely everything. So one of the things he thought of, he was concerned that the Germans, for whom he was doing this translating, they thought he was a French citizen who studied German in school. And so, but he didn't want his French to seem, his German to seem too perfect, because then they might somehow figure out that he was German. So he took a course, he signed up for a course in German, even though he spoke perfect German.
At the university.
In France, at the university. And he deliberately didn't do that well on the tests. so they would think that maybe he wasn't really that good a German speaker. I think one of the, this is sort of his, being this interpreter and translator for the French railroads is in many ways the most important part of the story, because he had a network as part of the French resistance of saboteurs and informants and all this sort of stuff, that this information was so important about troop movements and the movement of material and equipment and all this kind of stuff, and he was able to, and obviously at great risk to everybody concerned, to pass this information on. But I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah. My father knew where every troop transport, where every munitions transport, where every construction material transport was heading. And he passed that information. He had a radio operator. He also had some people who would be moving back and forth with the information got to the British. His boss, Louis Toulon, was married to a British woman. And he had said to Toulon, look, your job is too important. You shouldn't be involved in any of this. I'll take care of everything. But he knew that Toulon was pro-French. He knew that they had a relationship with the British. And my father was really working for the British. You have to understand, in 1940, contrary to what de Gaulle would have liked people to believe, at least after the war, there were very few resistors. In Brittany, there were a lot more resistors than probably in the rest of France, and certainly in the railroads. How did my father gather information? He had a number of ways. One, the Germans, they had an airfield in Baden where the bombers left from. They had commandeered a number of homes around. They needed a cook. My father found a Polish cook, and he said, look, I'm going to give you a job. You're going to be well fed. You need to steal food if you want. All I want from you is to stay up at night. And I want you to come back to me and tell me how many planes left, how many came back, how long they were gone, because that would tell the British where they were headed. He also made friends, that might be a way of describing it, was a maid in a hotel where the German pilots were staying. And when a pilot didn't come back, the Germans would put a ribbon on the door of the room where the pilot was staying, and then they would come and collect his belongings. So we said to the maid, I want you every day to tell me how many ribbons were on the doors. I would tell him how many pilots didn't come back. Additionally, every morning, my father went for a shave and massage at the local barber shop where the German pilots came after going on their bombing raids. People talk, German pilots talk. So he gathered a lot of information from just listening. But his master clue was, in the railroad offices there were telephones. And there were French radio operators, telephone operators, and German radio operators. And they got along. And sometimes the French would say, the Germans would say, I'm going to go have a beer. Would you mind just taking over? So when the Germans were gone, my father would pick up the phone and call Berlin. And with his roughest Prussian, even though he wasn't Prussian, accent, he asked what the orders were for the German bombers, how many planes had they lost in the meantime. He gathered an enormous amount of information that nobody knew. Right? At some point, the German, the head of the German railroad, the German side of the railroads, and the army needed someone to go with him to visit various places in Brittany. So he pleaded with Turgot to lend him my father. He told us, I can't really spare him, it's too important, of course it's dying to go. Right? So my father spent several weeks going around with the Germans to the submarine pens, to the places where their battleships were, to where construction was going on. All of this he was taking notes and recording and sending back. There was a gathering and way in Brest here. There was a grand hotel there where in the basement there was a gathering to celebrate Hitler's birthday. That information got back, and there were maybe 90, 100 German officers there. The British bombed that, and it was a very successful bombing raid. It cost the Germans heavily in very important people. That was, by the end of the time, he had maybe 300 people in his network working for him. What he realized also, the Germans, if there was sabotage, the Germans would take reprisals and just shoot people. So the Turban and my father figured out the Germans needed to speed up construction. And that meant that they needed many more railway workers because they needed to bring in materials from Germany, they needed more trains. So my father arranged for railway workers to go on leave just at the wrong time. And the building materials and the trains were backed up all the way from Brest to Berlin. And my father, who understood the German mentality, he complained to the Germans, said, you know, you're sabotaging your own work. We can't do our job, right? Because we can't move the trains. And in the meantime, he knew what was in those trains. There were munitions wagons that were bombed. It was a very clever way to slow down the German war effort. Because at that point, the Germans were winning the war. That's what it was.
So, has this network of 300 people, various kinds of saboteurs and informants and whatever, and they're doing their bit. But then he gets asked, because he's sufficiently important in this effort, he gets asked to go to England to train as an MI6 agent. So tell us a little bit about that.
So he met couple of people. This, by the way, is the train station with a park in front of it. So he met two brothers, the Lecoq brothers, who had set up a separate, for the French, for de Gaulle, resistance network that were mainly sabotage. And they were Britons. This is Ibn Lecoq, who is quite a character. I'm trying to find here it is. So the Lecoq brothers had a family home. You see where the A is there? It's literally at the point of Brittany. And the mother Lecoq maintained her home there. She was a beehive of activity for resistance. Germans were all the way around. They had come to near most of the homes. So the Lecoqs and a few others were there. They waited for a nice night. They arranged with the Brits to have a British ship meet them about 3 miles off the coast. So one night in December, or it was beginning of January, 42, they made their way to the ship. The ship made their way to basically Land's End. My father had informed the railways that he needed to have surgery, he was going to be gone for a few weeks. They trusted him. Right? In England, he was given parachute training. Interestingly enough, when he was doing the parachute training, his parachute instructor, he would say to his parachute instructor, "So, how many people survived this parachute training?" And the instructor said, "Well, probably about 50%." But he got his parachute wings. He learned to code and decode. He learned a lot of things that were important, and he was given. He had many different disguises. I don't know if I can find. There's the battleship. There's the ship that took them. It wasn't a similar ship. That's the ship that took them to Britain and took them back. So he was entrusted to set up a brand new network with the Lecoqs back in Brittany. He was entrusted with a very large sum of money, larger than anyone else. It was 500,000 francs, which I think in today's dollars is several $1 million at the time. He gets back safely. He gets on, and in the meantime, he knows that his network has been infiltrated. There's Madame Lecoq, there's the home, right on the waterfront. He catches a bus to a town, a close town, and catches a train to go to Rennes. Before he goes to Rennes, he stops by his lodgings. He gives the money to someone who doesn't want to be seen with the money. And this is where maybe the arrogance of youth comes into play. He had been so successful for so many months. He had a good alibi. He was just going to show up at the office as if nothing had happened. So he shows up at the railway, and he's greeted by the deputy German head of the railroads, who looks at him like he's seen a ghost. He says to my father, "Have a seat, would you like a cup of coffee?" I said, "Sure." He says, I have to make a phone call. He goes to make a phone call. In the next 10 minutes, there's about 10 of the German police who are there. That's what happened when he got back to France. Overnight, they brought him to Paris, to the prison of Fresnes, and that's when the good times really start. He doesn't think they really know who he is, but they have quite a bit of information, but he's not talking.
Explain where they got the information from.
So he had a radio operator, and the radio operator had been, first of all, negligent. He hadn't deleted messages that he should have deleted. One of my father's names during the war was the nephew, the neveu, because his handler was Thomas Green, Uncle Tom. Right? So Uncle Tom, my father, was his nephew, delivered. And so my father signed off on communications delivered. And the operator had been careless. And there were some messages that got back to England that had not been deleted. And when my father was in England, the network had been infiltrated. The radio operator had been taken into custody, badly manhandled, and he thought my father was still safe in England, and he gave my father up. They still didn't know who he was, but that's where they had the information. So they went back and forth. The Germans, between the Gestapo and the German counterintelligence, interrogated him, and they knew he had been to London. They knew he had been to England. He couldn't mask that. So they said, "Why did you go to England?" And he had thought up the story. And he said, because he understood the German mentality, he said, "You won't believe me." They said, "Try us." He said, "No, you really won't believe me." "No, really try us." He said, "Well, in 1939, before the war, I had met these English girls. They were twins. And I became engaged to one of them. And they went back to England. And sometime afterwards, I was listening to, it was better to tell the Germans some things because they knew you were doing it anyway. I was listening to a BBC broadcast. And I heard that this girl with the same name had become engaged, and I had to go to England to see him. So the Germans looked at him, and that's when they started hitting him back and forth. He was unconscious, and he heard one of the Germans say, "Only a Frenchman would do this." Only a Frenchman would do this. At that point, the Germans were still thinking they were winning the war, and they wanted to know what was happening in England. So they said, if you talk, if you tell us what's happening in England, we'll feed you better, we'll treat you better. So my father needed good food, so for 2 weeks he was taken from the Fen prison to the hotel where interrogations were taking place. They fed him royally, and for 2 weeks he talked about how things were just hunky-dory in England. No one was on rations, everyone was going about their business, they weren't defeated, and the Germans, after 2 weeks of this, they said, "Really? This is not something we can tell the Germans, we can't broadcast this." Went back into the hole. He was 11 months in solitary. They court-martialed him, death sentence, 5 mock executions. He was put in solitary. He walked 12 to 14 hours a day in the cell. 6 steps one way, 6 steps another way. Food was 6 ounces of bread and a cup of weak coffee once a day. And actually, while he was in solitary, it was once every 3 days. He thought it was time. There was a particular part of the prison where he knew if you were in that particular part of the prison, your time was up. You were going to be executed. They didn't execute him for a number of reasons, not the least of which they still thought they could get something out of him. And at that point, you want to talk about Martin? I could talk about that now.
Yes, this story though that Michel's talking about at the time is, the other statistic I remember besides his being in solitary confinement for 11 months is he remembered with great precision the number of times that he was beaten mercilessly. He was 33 or 35, but it was he really they really tried to break it, and they didn't.
Yes, he never talked.
I think his feeling was that if he talked, then they had the information that they needed so they could then shoot him. And if they thought he had a lot of valuable information and he hadn't talked, then he was potentially still useful to them. So they let him live. But you read through this book and the number of times in which he could have been killed. So you just can't count them. There's so many times that he could have been killed. So there's a little bit of luck, but also he was one of the things that Michel has mentioned a little bit, but I think it's an important, very important part of the story is he had a lot of cunning, and he really understood the German psyche. And those things are responsible as much as he could be responsible for keeping himself alive. That's how he did it. So he went from the Friend prison, then he was sent to as a knocked naval prisoner, which you can explain what that means, to Natzweiler in 1943.
So, end of 1942, the Germans still thought they were winning the war, and they realized that it only created more resistance if they just shot people on the spot. So there were people they wanted to disappear, and in the German Teutonic mythology, they issued this decree called Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog, which comes from the Ring of the Nibelungen, where the dwarf Alberich waves his wand and has a curse. People were to disappear into the night and fog. And so these particular prisoners were to disappear. No message was to be given to their families, where they had gone, what had happened, and they were never to be seen again. That was the idea. And they were to be given extra harsh treatment. So this was the decree issued by the head of the German High Command, Keitel, in December 1943. And my father was, in December 1942. And my father was among the first convoys of NNs from France in July of 1943. That went from Paris to Natzweiler. A trip that took 14 hours. Today, that trip takes 2 hours. Right? First, we have to understand the difference between death camps and concentration camps. Death camps, this is the German language. The death camps were the ones in Poland. Literally, people were just supposed to be murdered there. Concentration camps where a lot of people died, but the primary goal was not just to murder them as they arrived. But there were different degrees of concentration camps, and Natzweiler was the third degree, which was like a death camp. So my father arrives at Natzweiler, and they're trucked up the mountain at night from the railway station, and they arrive at the camp. There's a roll call place at the top of the camp. The camp is on a mountain with barracks, 12 barracks on the hillside. At the top was a roll call place where there was a gallows where they would hang prisoners. And there, the camp commandant, Kammer, who actually had been the first commandant at Dachau, a little aside, when my father, years later, went to see Schindler's List, I was a little worried. And I said, Papa, afterwards, what'd you think? And he looked at me and he said, the camp commandant at Natzweiler, Kammer, was 100 times worse than the commandant depicted in Schindler's List. That should tell you pretty much everything. So the camp commandant has these French prisoners, and he says to them, one of you speaks German. He already had the files, he knew which one it was. They played games. My father wasn't volunteering for anything, so he didn't step forward. Kammer asked again, And the third time he said, if the prisoner who speaks German doesn't step out, I'm going to pick at random 3 of you and shoot them. So my father's comrades turned to him and say, Andre, better 1 of you than 3 of us. So he became the interpreter, much against his will. He didn't want to really do that. The French NNs were in for harsh treatment. They were separated from all the other prisoners, at least initially, and then put in one of the barracks. And the treatment went from there. It went from bad to worse. So that you understand, again, the organization of the camps, to make sure that the world was upside down. There were 2 layers of authority. There were the SS, and then inside the camp, there was the internal camp administration. And the Germans put in charge of the camp administration common criminals, most of them German, murderers, rapists, thieves, robbers, whatever. There were different color badges on their uniforms. The criminals were green. The politicals or the resistors were red. And on top of that, if there were NNs, there was NN inscribed on it. The homosexuals were pink.
NN, again, being the Nacht im Nebel, which is the people who are supposed to be treated the worst. So we're all familiar with in concentration camp movies or whatever with people with Jewish stars, but they actually would have an NN badge, so
right,
to be sure that people understood that they were supposed to be treated terribly.
Right. Different colors. There was a color for homosexuals. There was a color for asocial people who didn't work, lost their job, whatever. So the world was upside down. It wasn't the elite of society that was in charge. It was the dregs of society. It was done on purpose. And they got better, being in the camp administration, they got better rations than the other prisoners, and so they did the bidding of the SS, and they were often harsher than the SS. So the goal of my father was to keep discipline among the French, to make sure that if they were in a work commando, if they could go outside the camp, they couldn't go out far because they were French. They went out with their heads up high because otherwise they would be beaten. Right? Inside the camp, there was a struggle among the camp inmates. And this went on for every day. There was a constant struggle to survive. There was a constant struggle not just with the Germans, but with the camp administration. There were some good people. There was a head, the overall head of the camp administrator, who was German. He was a German nationalist. His name was Willy, and he had been in the camp since 1933. He had been in World War I. He was a gunner. In World War II, in 1933, the Germans wanted him to become a member of the SS, and he said, I'm not putting on a black uniform. He was very pro-German, but he wasn't pro-Nazi. So they put him in the camp, and every year they marched him out and said, you want to put on the black uniform now? He said, no. So he was in the camps, and my father actually had a good friend in this German, saved his life in many different ways. Number of incidents. My father had developed over time a large growth in his inner leg that needed to be operated on. There was a infirmary at the bottom of the camp. And again, all of this was with inmates. There were inmate doctors, there were those kinds of people. So he was operated on, and he also got some respite if you were there. At some point, Willie found out that the SS were coming in, and anybody who was still bedridden in the camps would be taken out and shot. So an hour before the SS showed up, they spirited my father out of the infirmary, saved his life. Right? Luck, maybe. the there were several places that my father worked in the camps. The war commandos were done to help the German war effort. And at the end, there was, the last commando was in, was on the road up to the camp. There was a very bad curve. There had been a lot of accidents there. So the Germans wanted to straighten it out. And my father, who knew nothing about road building, said, I can do that. But he knew there was someone in the camp who was a road engineer. And so they would go out, the commando, and there were guards, but the guards were old, again, older Germans, were back from the front, and my father said to them, look, I promise you one thing, nobody's going to escape. You don't beat my workers, and we'll let you sleep. And we'll let you know if an inspector comes. Right? They were only too happy. So my father made sure that, first of all, not a lot of work got done. Two, that his men were able to rest to some extent. And on top of that, my father arranged so that it looked like they were ready, they had prepared wheelbarrows full of stones. When there was an inspector, all of a sudden they moved into action. And the most feared SS say to my father, do you always work like this? And my father had no fear of talking to us. Of course not. And I said, okay, of course not. So that's the camp.
So time is limited, and he was transferred to Dachau, and was there for like a year before the war ended, and we were liberated in April 29th, I think it was, 1945. But we might have a room for a few minutes of questions and answers, but maybe you can read the conclusion
I will.
of the book.
By the time my father and the rest of the people from the camp got to Dachau, it was September of 44. The Germans were losing the war. The camp was packed. It was an easier place than Natzweiler. Natzweiler, there was no place to hide. At Dachau, first of all, there was rampant disease. There was typhus, there was cholera, lice, which gave the typhus. And so the SS didn't want to come into the camps. There were still all the internal struggles. My father organized resistance within the camp because now they could see the end approaching. It was clear. Finally, the big day arrives. Actually, my father contracted typhus, managed through the help of a doctor friend to get some medication that saw him through that. Actually, last bit of anecdote. The SS had figured out that there were NN prisoners there, and the command had gone out that any of the NNs in the hospital were to be taken out and shot. And so my father's friends made sure that there was a corpse available, so that if they came looking for him, they would say, "Here he is." Right? He's already dead. You know? The Americans arrive, and my father's at the gates to greet them. And the first GI he sees, the soldier takes off helmet, and my father embraces the person. It turns out it's a female journalist. And when he realizes that, he embraces her again. Time to head back to Paris, and he's given a ride with GIs in a truck. And he says they're bombing along the road. They're going from Munich to Strasbourg, and they're bombing along the road. My father says to them, "Look, I survived 3.5 years here. I really want to make it back to Paris. So slow down, you know." So I'm going to read you the end of my father's words. And I think it's meaningful. Being in the underground was rich in itself. It was a great feeling to be doing something, to have a goal. With a target to reach, it was worth living even in dire circumstances. Danger did not count. Freedom of mind and physical freedom are a must, yet only when we lose them do we value them. No matter what the odds, these are worth fighting for. Even if the fight seems impossible to win, one must never, never give up. This is why so many women and men went to the ends of the earth, never to come back. And we few survivors must make sure their sacrifice was not in vain. We must feel responsible for the destiny of everybody. This is what will inform us and help us become immune in the future. It will immunize us against all negations of the values on which our civilization is based. That is why we must not leave anything untold about this terrible past. That is why this book had to be written. So we open it up to questions.
Questions, comments, anything?
I'm amazed, as probably you are, I'm amazed your father survived. But at the end of the camp, how much did he weigh? Did he ever say?
Yes, he weighed 40 kilos, he weighed 80 pounds. 80, somewhere between 80 and 88 pounds, yes.
Yes.
At risk of asking something that you may have already said at the beginning, how
Can you take the microphone?
come his French was so good?
In Europe, even before World War I, the most common language that was studied in Germany was French, and actually in France, the most common language that was studied was German. So it wasn't unusual for Germans to speak French, educated Germans, right? That was the reason. And my father was a good linguist, although he never lost. We always laughed because I grew up in New Bedford, but we moved to South Dartmouth, and my father would always say he was from South Dartmouth. Never lost that accent.
But those of you who are a little bit older might remember that not that many years ago, French was the international language. And now, fortunately for us, it's English, but but for many years it was French.
He was able to pass as a negative.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
By the way, it runs in the family because Michel won the German prize in high school.
Right. My parents only spoke French at home. You know, one thing that I didn't talk about was my mother. My father met my mother after the war at his uncle and aunt's house who had been hidden in a suburb of Paris. And he was dumbstruck by her. She wasn't interested in him, and so to get her interested in him, he managed to spill a cup of tea on her. At which point she had to recognize him, and that was the beginning. She had been in England. She was born in Leipzig. No, she wasn't. She was born in Midzerowicz in Poland, moved to Leipzig. Long story. She had been to Palestine before the war, and then England, and she was in the Royal Air Force Secret Service, and her job was to intercept German fighter bomber messages, and because she spoke perfect German, to redirect the bombers to places they could drop their bombs harmlessly. She received a medal. You know, you've heard of Bletchley Park. That's where she was involved. So she also had a fascinating story in the war. I gave her much too much short shrift, which is a shame. We spent an hour on that.
And according to the book, I think she spoke 6 or 7 languages.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yes, right. One of her sisters had an interesting trajectory, was in Germany, managed to get out 38 to Argentina, where her husband was, to New York. And years later, my mother would say to her sister, "Ah, Rosa, you forgot your German and you never learned English." So that's 1995. My father insists on going back to Germany for the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau. And I said to him, "Why do you want to do this? You're not feeling well. You're really infirm. You've been there several times. There's really no need." And he said, "I want to go back to show the Germans that I'm still here and the Thousand-Year Reich is not." He knew why he was in the camps. He knew that he was an enemy of the Reich. And that gave him the strength to fight on. That's it. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for being here. If you would like to have your book signed, please make a beautiful line going this way towards the name section, and all will